Aswan High Dam, which controls the River Nile in southern Egypt, is the largest rock-filled dam in the world. Yet it is very difficult to get a good look at it. That's because it's almost impossible to determine where the land ends and the dam begins. In fact, you can be standing on it and not know it. The Aswan Dam is that big. 3 years of Nile water is stored behind it. If released all at once, this water would sweep through the Nile Valley, potentially wiping out the entire country in a day.
The superiority of this engineering is not only in its design, the concept of its landfill, but also in its enormous size. It's a massive project. And indeed, it is more massive than Cheops Pyramid at Giza in Cairo.
The people of Egypt have a saying: the Nile is Egypt, and Egypt is the Nile. Since the beginning of recorded time, the Nile has been the source of life for the land through which it flows. This is true perhaps most of all in Egypt, a land of relentless desert, where rain is sometimes not seen for a decade. The 1,000-mile course of the Nile through Egypt is a narrow valley of green never more than 12 miles wide, until it reaches Cairo and broadens in the delta to meet the Mediterranean Sea. These fertile areas make up less than 5% of Egypt's land, yet 96% of her population live here. 65 million people living in an area only slightly larger than the state of Maryland. To the people of the Nile Valley, the river is the annual miracle that gives life to their parched and scorched lands.
Egypt does not exist without the Nile. The Nile is the factor that created Egypt. And Egyptians are extraordinarily proud of the Nile. I mean, they view themselves, the Egyptians, as the earliest civilization in terms of a highly structured government, a highly powerful government, the accomplishments of the pharaonic civilization. And all of this was due to the Nile.
The ancient Egyptians prayed to Hapi, the god of the river, for the gift of water.
The Nile was what enabled the great stones for the pyramids to be floated down on the flood, to be built. But it's essentially the agriculture. Without that, you could not have had the extraordinary productivity and fertility of the soil that enabled Egypt for millennia not only to produce enough food for themselves, but to export food.
But nature can be fickle. Some years the Nile's gifts weren't so welcome.
Throughout the entire history of Egypt, ancient, Coptic and Islamic, you get all of these stories of what happened when Egypt underwent either flood or drought. These are very common stories that are told not only through the books of religion, but also through myth. And we see from these stories the tremendous suffering that Egyptians went through.
As far back as 3,000 years BC, the pharaohs built levees to protect farmland from flooding. Barrages or barriers were erected in the river to divert the flow into irrigation canals and ditches. The early Egyptians were accomplished water managers. They learned to build low mud walls to hold the water for longer periods in shallow basins. Needing to make water in effect run uphill, they devised methods like the water wheel, which are still in use today. The Nile carried sediment called silt all the way from the highlands of Ethiopia. During a normal flood season, when the Nile overcame its banks, it deposited this rich fertilizer onto the farmland. When the water receded, the silt remained. Combined with enough water and given Egypt's year-round sunshine, this silt made Egypt the richest farmland in the world, capable of yielding 3 crops a year. But that was in a good year. And there were many bad ones. For thousands of years of Egyptian history, there was no way to save the water of the good year for the salvation of the bad. Once the precious Nile water escaped into the Mediterranean, it was gone forever. Since 1517, the Ottoman Turks had ruled Egypt. In 1805, Muhammad Ali the Great, father of modern Egypt, became viceroy to the Turkish Sultan. The Egyptian leader was ambitious, looking for new ways to enrich his country. His French advisors suggested he plant cotton and sell the harvest to Europe. This advice would seem particularly shrewd a half-century later, when the cotton crop of the southern United States was blockaded during the American Civil War, allowing Egypt to corner the world cotton market. The new crop required water in the late spring and summer when the Nile is low. Egypt needed a method of retaining the waters from the flood season. Muhammad Ali authorized the construction of a barrage at the apex of the delta, just beyond Cairo, in order to hold a head of water high enough to supply canals and ditches to the north. But he never saw it finished. It was not until the reign of his grandson, Ismail Pasha, that the project was successfully completed under the supervision of the British, who had a heavy interest in Egypt's cotton crop. By 1890, it could hold a head of 13 feet and was diverting water into the delta.
A lot of the earlier barrages were principally built using large pieces of stone cut from rocky hills in the surrounding sites. In fact, the ancient Egyptians built most of their temples from exactly the same kind of stone.
By the end of the 19th century, the relatively new building material, reinforced concrete, was revolutionizing bridge and dam construction all over the world. Egypt's eternal dream of damming the Nile was now, for the first time, within the realm of possibility. The site chosen for this first dam was at Aswan, a small trading town in Upper Egypt. Here the Nile narrows and picks up speed.
The Aswan Dam itself was then built later during the reign of Khedive Tawfiq, who governed Egypt during the latter part of the 19th century. It was built with British help in terms of its engineering, but it was also a project whose architecture is very similar to the kind of projects that you see all over Europe and on rivers built around the early part of the 19th century.
The original Aswan Dam, the Low Dam as it's commonly known today, stretched 2 miles across the valley and rose nearly 90 feet above the riverbed. It was designed to allow the bulk of the annual flood to flow freely through its gates. Then, in the last stage of the flood, the gates were closed, holding back just enough of the water to re-irrigate the fields later in the summer. The Low Dam increased the productivity of Egypt's arable land, but it was neither big enough nor strong enough to store more than a year's supply of water. And on the African continent, droughts lasting several years or more are not uncommon. The success of the Low Dam was a boon to Egypt, but it only provided temporary relief from the dilemma that had haunted her always. And the new century would find that dilemma becoming ever more critical. During the early part of the 19th century, in the reign of Muhammad Ali, there was a cropped acre of land for every inhabitant of Egypt. By the end of his grandson Ismail's reign a few decades later, that figure had dropped to 3/4 of an acre. Once known as the breadbasket of civilization for the abundant surplus of her harvest, now Egypt struggled to feed her own. Even with every inch of workable farmland in Egypt planted and producing crops, the country was losing ground. The population was increasing rapidly, while the food supply remained static. For centuries, Egypt had been ruled or occupied by foreign powers. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Turks, all grew rich exploiting her limited resources, while Egypt herself remained hamstrung by poverty. By the end of the 19th century, Egypt was deep in debt to European bankers. Her cotton crop was heavily mortgaged, and she had been forced to sell her shares in the Suez Canal, the most profitable waterway in the hemisphere, which her people had labored so long to build. The canal was jointly owned by the French and the British. In 1882, in response to some nationalistic rumblings in Egypt, Great Britain sent an army to occupy the country and protect their investment. They were to remain there for nearly 75 years. In 1936, Egypt was granted her independence from the Turks, but the British remained. The first 50 years of the 20th century saw a steady increase in the Egyptian population. By 1950, there were only 2 cropped acres for every 7 people. Egypt was declining year after year, until now it stood as one of the poorest nations in the world, and getting poorer every day.
Egyptians throughout the 20th century were always of the belief that they have been held back because of the issues relating principally to the inability to control the flow of water in the Nile. And as such, it was always a dream. People talked about it in novels, they talked about it in literature, they talked about it in popular culture. The notion of being able to solve this problem was so much on the minds of Egyptians, and it was certainly on the minds of the Egyptian officers who took control of the Egyptian government in the early 50s as part of the Egyptian Revolution.
On July 23, 1952, the Egyptian Revolution began with a bloodless coup. A group of army officers calling themselves Free Officers seized power, sending King Farouk and his family into exile. On the day he took power, the leader of the Free Officers, Gamal Abdel Nasser, became the first true Egyptian to rule his country since the last Said pharaoh submitted to the Persians in the middle of the 6th century BC. The new young regime looked around for a symbol, a rallying point with which to unite Egyptians and instill confidence in the world community that the nation was in capable hands. Within 2 weeks, they had found their cause. It was an engineering project that had been lying dormant in some bureaucratic cubbyhole. A highly ambitious plan for a world-class dam to be built at Aswan, within sight of the low dam. The high dam would be the first great step forward into the progressive future Nasser had promised the people.
The Revolutionary Command Council, but particularly Gamal Abdel Nasser, said, we're going to do this. This will symbolize the new Egypt. This will symbolize our revolution. And most important, this will give to us the security that Egypt needs and does not have.
As the plans were developed, it became apparent that the new high dam would take 10 years to build. And although it could potentially double Egypt's agricultural output, that increase would be effectively canceled out by the increase in population during the years it took to build it. But this was still good news. For the first time since the beginning of the 20th century, Egypt would at least not be getting poorer. An even more exciting prospect was the potential of the new dam to generate hydroelectric power. Enough power to light up 20,000 rural Egyptian villages that had never before had electricity. That same power could be used to industrialize, provide jobs, and manufacture products to sell on the world market.
This was to be the tremendous symbol of regeneration of Egypt in terms of agriculture, expanding more agricultural land, increasing productivity, but it also meant industrial production. You would get more energy, electrical energy from the power surges through the dam, and this supposedly would lead to an industrial growth that Egypt had never dreamed of before.
Nasser declared that nothing would be allowed to stand in the way of the high dam. It became known as Nasser's Pyramid. At this stage, the Egyptian leader received a well-timed gift from an unlikely source. Earlier in 1952, West Germany had paid Israel 3 billion marks in reparation for Jewish suffering under Hitler. When the Arab states complained that these funds would serve to strengthen their enemy, West Germany offered this consolation: a team of top German engineering experts would work up proposals for the design, construction, and financing of the Aswan High Dam. Egypt accepted the offer gratefully and then set out to raise financing for the project.
Where do you find the cash? You go to those people that have it. And they happen to be in the West, and particularly the United States. And the cash, as we all know, in the United States resides largely at the World Bank, which is on Pennsylvania Avenue, just down from the White House.
The World Bank may have been eager to loan Egypt the money for the High Dam, but their most influential member had strong reservations. The United States, which in effect controlled or at least heavily influenced the world lenders, did not approve of what it considered Nasser's left-leaning social programs or his cozy relations with the Soviet Union. This was in the midst of the Cold War, and the Western powers were not anxious to further empower what they considered a candidate for the Soviet bloc. The design phase took 2 years. Once the German designs were complete, the World Bank sent experts to judge whether or not the dam made sense economically for Egypt and her investors. That process took another 2 years. By 1956, the World Bank had decided to back the project. But complications arose in the meantime. When fighting with Israel broke out, Nasser asked the West for arms, but was rejected. He turned then to the Soviets, who brokered an arms deal with Czechoslovakia. Then Nasser angered Western capitalists further by officially recognizing Communist China. Nasser had never liked the terms of the loan the World Bank was offering. He thought they gave the West too much control over Egypt's internal affairs. But now his advisors were telling him to accept the offer while it was still on the table. Nasser accepted the offer only to be informed by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles that the offer had been withdrawn. Angry and humiliated, Nasser announced that he had an alternative plan for the financing of the dam. On July 26, 1956, he announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The Aswan High Dam, Nasser said, would be built with the profits from the canal.
When the canal was nationalized in 1956, it was nationalized only a few years before it was to revert to Egyptian control. Because the lease was for 99 years, from 1869 technically until 1968. It's always forgotten that Egypt had promised to compensate the shareholders, principally the British and the French, from the income of the canal for all of their shares. Egypt, in fact, did abide by this promise. And by 1963, Egypt had paid the shareholders what it owed.
Seizing the Suez Canal for Egypt was more than a money issue. It sent a signal to the world that Egypt was resolved in its new course of self-determination. France and Great Britain reacted angrily, sending troops to invade Egypt and take back the canal.
It aroused the animosity of the British, who had just signed the treaty to evacuate the canal with Nasser, and thought he had planned to do this ahead of time, which he hadn't. And of course, the Israelis were afraid that Nasser was going to start buying weapons, which he had already done from the Czechs. So the three of them came together and decided to invade Egypt, which they did in 1956, England, France, and Israel. Eisenhower deplored this and stopped them and forced them to withdraw from the territories they had occupied. Russia and America both stepped in and said, enough is enough, out you go. But the canal was already nationalized, and Egypt used the funds of that canal to help build the high dam in Aswan.
Egypt had few friends left in the world when a new offer of financing appeared in October of 1958. The Soviets were proposing to build the dam. Their deal contained more strings than the Western offer, but that proposal was long gone. The Russians were willing to help with the dam, but only if it were seen as a Soviet triumph. Built by Russian engineers with Russian equipment, the Soviets meant to keep the admiration and acclaim for themselves. But Nasser would get his high dam. The town of Aswan is over 2,000 years old. In ancient times, it was a marketplace where goods from all over the African continent were bought and sold. Now, in 1960, Egyptian and Russian engineers came to Aswan to begin work on a dam that would not only provide complete control of the seasonal and annual flow of the Nile, but would also be a constant source of electrical power during any one year. The site selected for the new dam was just 4 miles south or upstream of the old low dam. The riverbanks there were both solid granite.
The dam had to be built somewhere south of the old small Aswan Dam, principally because of the fact that this is the area where you're almost at the southern tip of Egypt. That's from where you can control most of the flow of the Nile. Additionally, that's also the area that would allow you to build or construct a lake behind the dam that would have the least disastrous effects. That area was the least cultivable area, and it's an area that is principally a desert landscape.
On the negative side was the condition of the river bottom, a soft mass of silt and sandy deposits. This base would have to be solidified to prevent water from seeping under the future dam. The German designers had calculated Egypt's annual water requirements all the way back to the time of the pharaohs. They determined that Egypt's current needs could be met by creating a reservoir holding 170 billion cubic meters of water. Since the bottom of the River Nile was soft and unstable to a great depth, a conventional concrete structure was out of the question. The high dam had to be a rock-fill dam, a hill or ridge in the river made of boulders, gravel, and sand. The rock-fill dam is molded to the river bottom, distributing its weight over a large area and at no point offering a perpendicular front to the force of the flood. The plan called for rock-fill coffer or temporary dams on the upstream and downstream sides. These would divert the river's flow while the core of the dam was built. In conventional dams, the coffers are destroyed when the dam is built, but in this case, it was proposed to mold the upstream and downstream coffers into the main dam and lay a concrete blanket over them both so that they would form the northern and southern faces of the dam. The central core, held firm between the coffers, would be constructed of clay and strengthened by a horizontal rib of reinforced plastic concrete below the crest on the downstream side. The half-mile section of the dam and the river would lie on a thick carpet of dune sand, compacted by a system of vibration. It would rise in a slow ascent to reach a peak of 350 feet and then fall gradually away into the river, half a mile to the north. The Egyptian, German, and Russian engineers were all fully aware of the consequences should there be a flaw in the design or construction of the high dam. The reservoir behind the dam was expected to hold 3 years' worth of Nile water. If the dam were to break, the force and depth of that water flowing down the Nile would wipe out the Nile Valley completely, and with it, the 65 million people living there. Egypt, for all intents and purposes, would cease to exist. A critical question was how to stop water from passing under the dam through the soft, sandy river bottom until it eventually undermined the structure. Since 1952, the German engineers had experimented with the soil and sand of the river bottom. They determined that the most effective solution would be to create a grout curtain, a mixture of clay and cement injected with hollow drills into the soft sand of the riverbed. This would create a wall of artificial rock to a depth of 600 feet below the bottom of the dam. After the agreement between Egypt and the Soviet Union had been signed, the Russians took the West German design back to Moscow, where they modified and simplified it.
If the Germans did not have much experience in building dams, they were good engineers and could design one. The Russians had enormous amount of experience in building dams.
The Russians agreed with the necessity of a grout curtain, but they offered an alternative to the German plan for water diversion. The German design called for water tunnels to be built under the dam and under the riverbank, where they would be safe from aerial bombardment.
One of the great concerns that the Egyptians had, and in which they kind of drove the Germans crazy in the design of the dam, was, of course, their great fear, which they had of the Israelis. And if you're going to build this dam, somebody can blow it up. There was a great deal of discussion back and forth over this issue, which finally died away when it became evident that you're going to build a dam which has 42 billion cubic meters of rock, and sand, and clay, that the only thing that could ever damage that dam is some monumental atomic explosion.
The Russian alternative called for just one large diversion channel, 2,000 yards long and 66 yards wide, to be built in the eastern riverbank. The hydroelectric station would be built in this channel. Here, the water would plunge downward, passing through the station's 12 turbines to produce a maximum output of 2,100 megawatts, 1/3 more than America's Hoover Dam. The work began on January 9, 1960, when President Nasser personally ignited 20,000 tons of dynamite to begin work on the diversion channel. When the smoke cleared, a new era for Egypt had begun. The first stage of construction of the Aswan High Dam was the most critical. The diversion channel had to be completed by the summer of 1964, before the August flood reached Aswan.
Well, when the Russians arrived in 1961, the Egyptian engineers, and these people have been living on the Nile since the beginning of time, and they knew exactly its flow and how it operated. They told the Russians that if we're going to build those cofferdams, we've got to get them up before we get a high flood. Otherwise, a high flood will just wash out a half-finished cofferdam.
It was slow going. Aside from the predictable language and cultural barriers, there was a scarcity of equipment, and always the oppressive Egyptian heat. In the summer, the temperature rose to 125 degrees in the shade. During these months, once they had electric power, work was performed at night. The Egyptian engineers blamed Russian inefficiency and the failure of Russian equipment.
The Russian equipment were designed for cold weather, and Aswan is one of the hottest places in the world. The second problem they had was that organizing and getting enormous amounts of equipment from Central Asia and from deep Russia all the way to Aswan was extremely complicated. Those routes have never been traversed before. And the third problem was that who's going to drive it? A couple of camel boys?
Broken equipment, worn-out drills, or trucks with flat tires led to delays and work stoppages. Squabbling and general discontent led to disorders and strikes at the dam site. The contract with the Soviets had forbidden any but Russian contractors from working at the dam. But now it was becoming obvious to Nasser that the Russians were incapable of meeting the 1964 deadline. Over the angry objections of the Soviets, Nasser subcontracted the job to Arab contractors. The Arabs had experience with large projects, had worked on the Suez Canal and the Cairo airport. The new contractors abandoned the faulty Russian equipment in favor of the British tools they had used successfully in the past. 30,000 Egyptian and Arab laborers were hired at top wages paid in Russian rubles. The tide began to turn in 1962 as more men and supplies were poured into Aswan. As work progressed more smoothly and progress could be seen, morale improved. Egyptians and Russians were drawn together into a mutual respect, proud to be working on what they knew was the project of a lifetime. In May of 1964, the diversion channel and upstream cofferdam was complete with months to spare, to the great relief of engineers and politicians alike. President Nasser invited Nikita Khrushchev to celebrate the event. With the deadline met, completion of the high dam was now in sight. The solution to Egypt's age-old problem, the unpredictability of the Nile, was within grasp. The high dam would increase Egypt's agricultural output by 30%. The hydroelectric station would provide 8 times her current electrical power. But progress would not come without a price. The reservoir lake soon to be created by the high dam would eventually extend 300 miles into the desert of Upper Egypt and into the Sudan. This desert was Nubia, home for millennia to one of the world's oldest and proudest cultures.
Nubia is one of the most ancient kingdoms, the old kingdom of Kush. Nubians have been there, they're not Arabs, they've been there since the beginning of time. And this became a violent issue, vitriolic issue between the Egyptians and the Sudanese until the signing of the Nile Waters Agreement of 1959, which did 2 things. One is, it divided the Nile waters between the Sudan and Egypt. And the second thing it did was it provided, unfortunately, very little compensation from the Egyptians for the relocation of the Nubians, a subject of much bitterness in the Sudan still to this day.
Amid the rising water, in a 20th century version of Noah's Ark, 117,000 Nubians were relocated hundreds of kilometers from their homeland. As compensation for their loss, each Nubian family was given a new home, an allowance, and 1 to 3 acres of irrigated land. And for the first time in their lives, they would have electricity. But other precious victims remained in the flood's path.
Many ancient Egyptian temples were going to be completely drowned in Lake Nasser. The most important site was the Abu Simbel Temple. This was a temple that has always existed on the Nile shores in a peninsula and had always been a major site that tourists used to come to visit.
The prospect that these temples would be submerged forever sent a shockwave through the archaeological world. Once the scope of the situation became known, UNESCO, the United Nations organization, sought proposals to rescue 23 of the temples, including the Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel and the Temple of Philae near Aswan.
Some of them included some crazy things like we can make a wall of glass and people can go down in elevators and look at the temples and then return them. The proposal that was eventually accepted was to cut the temples into pieces and put them back together higher up on the hill so that they wouldn't be washed out by the water.
The Temple of Philae was able to be relocated in that manner. But the temples of Ramses II and his wife Nefertari presented an even bigger problem. These temples were not freestanding, but had been carved out of the mountain behind them. The effort to save the temples at Abu Simbel was an engineering feat nearly as difficult and complex as the building of the high dam itself. Three teams of engineers working day and night for 5 years moved not only the temples, but part of the mountain they were carved from.
The temple was right there. You see that huge rock, 60 meters below, the temple was located there. And 5 multinational companies came here and they started to cut the whole mountain into pieces, and they cut the temple into blocks, and they transfer everything 60 meters higher and 200 meters to the back. This is a safe place because they know that the water of this lake, the highest level will be 183 meters above sea level. And now the temple is in a safe place because it's on the level 184 above sea level.
Today, the landscape around Lake Nasser is full of relocated temples, many of which have the stamp of a conservation effort by one particular country or another, whether we're talking about Germany, Holland, or we're talking about France. And it's very interesting that these countries take pride in the fact that they contributed to the building of the Aswan High Dam, and accordingly, in a sense, to the making of Lake Nasser through the preservation effort of these temples. It's very interesting because it's a twist. What the West denied Egypt in terms of funding for the building of the dam ended up going to the preservation of what the West saw as the international heritage, which is ancient Egyptian civilization and its temples.
The Aswan High Dam was completed in 1970, 10 long years after construction began. For the first time in its noble and storied history, the River Nile had been tamed. Egypt was rescued from her century-long spiral into poverty. The cost had been high, approximately $1.2 billion. It had also taken a toll in pain and suffering. An estimated 1,000 men lost their lives through accidents at the site. The dam removed the specter of starvation from Egypt's foreseeable future. But it was not a perfect solution. 30 years after completion, its side effects continue to reverberate. Nearly a half-century ago, a poor nation in the desert made some hard decisions for her future. Decisions that would ensure her survival as a nation and as one of the world's most lasting and treasured cultures. Today, Egypt is reaping the benefits and the consequences of those decisions.
According to many international organizations and world-renowned scholars, the Great Dam is considered one of the most important achievements of the 20th century. Egypt gained a lot out of the Great Dam: total control of the water of the river and getting our vital needs of water regardless of the amount of upcoming flooding of the river.
The High Dam rescued Egypt from the famine that has racked much of Africa since 1972. The dam also protected Egyptian crops and villages from 4 years of high floods. As for the hydroelectric station, today it allows Egypt to export surplus power to her Arab neighbors. Yet as successful as the dam was in solving Egypt's eternal water crisis, there has been a downside to the High Dam.
The High Dam meant to Egypt that electrification, increasing water for irrigation, preventing famine from occurring. On the negative side, it raised the subsoil water, which ruined agriculture in the delta. It increased salination, which ruined the monuments. It changed the climate, which may be a good thing, depending how ecologically minded you are. So that you have both the for and the against. There are those who believe it should never have been built there. It should have been built to the west in the Qattara Depression. But Nasser wanted it there, and there it was.
One of the principal negative effects has been the absence of silt. The agricultural land is no longer covered by the deposits of silt that used to come with the floods. As a result, Egyptian farmers have to depend much more extensively on chemical fertilizers, which have had some very negative effects in the first years.
The silt is lying at the bottom of the dam of Lake Nasser. That silt can be used to fertilize the whole of Egypt. And it's also decreasing the amount of water that's being kept in the dam, because it's raising the bed of the Lake Nasser. If somebody could invent a way to remove that silt and to use it, then Egypt wouldn't need chemical fertilizers.
The greatest criticism of the dam is the massive loss of water from evaporation that you have from this huge 350-mile reservoir. But it no longer makes Egypt the hostage to unfriendly, hostile, and unstable states upstream. That is the bottom line, and that is what makes all the criticism of the dam, no matter how valid, but for the Egyptians, irrelevant.
Today, Egypt continues to look far ahead into her future. There is already a highly ambitious project underway to create a man-made branch of the Nile. Starting from the village of Tashka on the shore of Lake Nasser, the new channel would parallel the River Nile.
Oh, it's a monumental investment. It cost more than the High Dam and the Suez Canal put together.
The Tashka project is considered the dream of the future and the coming generations because the majority of the Egyptians live in the regions of the valley and the delta. There is a real population crisis. There is a pressing need to transfer some of these dense populated areas of the valley and the delta to places outside these areas.
Egypt in the future has two Niles, not only one. Has two valleys, not only one. The other valley actually, or the other Nile actually is starting from Toshka, going to the oasis and all the way to the Mediterranean. And between the two Niles, you can again establish another civilization in Egypt.
Once you give the desert water and fertilizer, then it blooms. And you can have a second Nile Valley if this project comes to fruition. And therefore you could feed twice as many as you do today. You wouldn't need to import wheat from America. You would have your own wheat, you would have your own food, and you could even supply Africa with food as well.
Looking back at Egypt's struggles over the last century to feed and accommodate its exploding population, it seems little more than a dream that this nation, once called the breadbasket of civilization, might again take on that role. But if history proves anything about the Egyptians, it's that they are survivors and they are not daunted by large projects.
I think Egyptians like to build monumental things. It goes back to the pharaohs.
Gamal Abdel Nasser died in 1970 without ever seeing the Aswan High Dam completed.
Nasser's funeral was an unbelievable event where 1 million Egyptians showed up in the streets of Cairo to mourn his death. It was ironic that, in a sense, 6 months later, the Aswan High Dam was opened by Anwar Sadat, his successor. What exists today as a lasting commemoration of Gamal Abdel Nasser's effort is principally the fact that the lake, which is the largest lake in Egypt and one of the largest lakes in Africa, and indeed one of the largest artificial lakes in the world, is called Lake Nasser. So Nasser's name will never be forgotten from this project.
30 years after completion, the High Dam is taken for granted by many Egyptians not old enough to remember the effects of drought or flood. But each of their lives has been greatly affected by the dam. It has become, as Nasser often called it, a pyramid for the living. No structure in the history of the world has ever changed a nation as much as the Aswan High Dam has changed Egypt.